Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Very nice to have you still with us. We're going to start the afternoon session with a talk from Alison Pouliot.
Oh, I never know how you say it.
Pouliot. Who is I think we can all agree, a world-renowned fungi geek and all-round wonderful fungal person. We were very fortunate to have her launch her with us yesterday, and we're very fortunate to have her continue this conversation and insights with us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Agneva. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. This is the slot where everybody usually goes to sleep as you're trying to digest that lunch. So thanks for coming back. I thought today, because mostly the talks are mostly focused on the mushrooms or the sporocarps or the sporing bodies, that is the reproductive part of the fungus, the organ of the organism, so to speak. I thought I'd go beyond mushrooms to talk about the mycelium, that is the living organism, the living, growing, feeding part of the fungus. And I'm sure you've all seen that. We head below the ground, below the surface of the ground. I thought it was appropriate given I come from down under after all. But you've all seen, thank you, the mycelium, I presume. When you've rolled back some leaf litter or some dug around in the compost, have you seen that spiderwebby tapestry of those long white fibres of fungus mycelium? Is this familiar to you all? So, okay, what fungi actually do in soil? I thought I'd talk a little bit about that and then go on to fungus relationships. So when we see that mycelium, what it's actually doing is giving us a foundation for everything that's above soil. The forest, those trees, they aren't just standing on the surface of the soil. Of course, their root system penetrates into the soil. And what the fungus is doing is putting architecture, a scaffold into the soil. And if you can imagine these long white fibres called hyphae that collectively form the fungus mycelium, the growing feeding part. It's under the soil, it's moving around, it's looking for food, secreting enzymes, breaking down that organic matter and directly absorbing nutrition that way. But as it moves through the soil, what it's actually doing is it's holding the soil particles apart. And as soon as we hold soil particles apart, it becomes aerated or anaerobic. It becomes inhabitable for a great range of other organisms, such as the spineless things like the bugs and beetles and worms and slaters and other things that live in soil. And as they move further through the soil, they aerate it through their movements and through biting into organic matter and breaking it down. By holding the soil particles apart, this also allows water to very gently trickle down through the soil, down to the deeper horizons of the soil. So fungi are not only aerating soils, they're allowing water to move gently through soils, and they're making it inhabitable to other organisms. That is, they're making it biological, which is very different to dirt. So dirt is basically the mineral components. Soil is the mineral components plus the biology. And oftentimes what we do, for example, through things such as forestry or agriculture, when we compact soil, through heavy machinery, say harvesting machinery, we press out the oxygen, we lose the mycelium. What happens is eventually they become anaerobic. Without oxygen, the water doesn't move through them. Have you often noticed if you drive along a highway after a flood and there's a forest on one side and a field on the other, often the field is flooded. You'll see the water sitting on the surface, but you don't see that in the forest. That's because that architecture is in place. So I guess what I'm very, very inspired by working with all kinds of innovative farmers now who are saying, how can I get fungus mycelium back into my agricultural soils? It's not just compaction, it's also physical disturbance. When we're tilling or turning soil over, we break up that gossamer thin network of fungus mycelium. So I think the fungal turn is at a very exciting time in that I think farmers and horticulturalists and all kinds of people, gardeners, are saying, how can I maximise all these great things that fungi actually do in soils by aerating my soils, allowing water to move, making it more biological? And they're rethinking, do I need to dig? Do I need to use chemicals? Do I need to compact the soil? Do I need to burn it? And so I love that there's this sort of new overlay of thinking, fungi are in the equation as well. But where this mycelium to me becomes all the more astonishingly arcane is when it forms relationships. That is, I'm sure you're familiar with the term mycorrhizal symbiosis. So the prefix myco, of course, means fungus, rhizal means root, symbiosis means an alliance. Now, I like to keep my presentations really high tech. So I brought along, I have to just use both hands, a little physical demonstration rather than a PowerPoint. Exhibit A is a poster tube. Now imagine this represents a tree root magnified about 500 times. Right now, we're all moving down below the soil. Just imagine we're beneath the soil surface, and here's this giant tree root. It's feeling around underneath the soil, looking for water, looking for nutrients. That's what tree roots do. They're basically a pipe to conduct water, conduct nutrients. And so it comes across a bit of wood under the soil. The tree root can't actually extract the nutrients that are bound up, that are locked up in the cellulose, in the lignin, in that wood. It doesn't have the capacity to extract what it needs from that buried piece of wood. And I was taught in botany that tree roots are very good at getting nutrients, getting water. Well, it's not really that true. They can get some water, they can get some nutrients, but they can't get enough because they can't unlock those nutrients. What the tree root needs is its fungal partner. It needs the mycelium, which I demonstrate with my great aunt's pantyhose collection. And so what we've got here, remember, this is the magnified tree root. We're all below the soil surface now. Here's the tree root, and here's the fungus mycelium. And what it does is it forms a mantle or a sheath around the tree root. Well, can I get you to grab a foot, a toe? Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll get you to. That's great. Can I get you to grab a toe for me? Thank you. So what's actually happening here? Now, don't you all let go, will you? Is what the fungus mycelium does is it expands out the root system of the tree. And the fungus is much, much finer than the finest tree root. So it can get in between those tiny interstitial spaces, those tiny gaps between the particles of dirt and soil. Places where the tree root is too big and clumsy and clunky, it can't actually access those pores, those spaces in the soil. But the fungus mycelium can, so it's got much greater reach to the soil. But what it has that the tree root doesn't is a great cache of chemicals, particularly enzymes that can break down plant matter. So the two structural components that give hardness to wood are cellulose and lignin. And only fungi are the only organisms that have the enzymes to break down lignin. The plant can't break down lignin and unlock those nutrients. So the fungus can break down lignin, break down cellulose, and it can actually expand out the root system, the absorbable root system of the tree. We think perhaps even up to 1,000 times or more. So imagine a tree that doesn't have its fungal partner. It's got very little reach into the soil compared to one that's got this massive expansion of its root system. And some fungi do other things. Some have a bit of a defense mechanism. They can secrete all kinds of chemicals that can kill things such as nematode worms. You know, these microscopic worms that can cause huge damage in crop monocultures and things like that. We know some fungi can actually twist their mycelium into a loop. And when a nematode comes along and swims through that loop, it actually constricts by hydrostatic pressure and strangles the nematode. So mycelium can do all kinds of really crazy things. And what we know from people like the work of Suzanne Simard, who's been mentioned in many of the talks today, but also people long before Suzanne Simard, is that it's not just one set of fungi that connect to one tree, but that this mycelium or this mycorrhizal network actually connects up to other trees. And I think it was Suzanne's work, she showed that on average, what she calls a mother tree, that is an old tree, or a hub tree in a forest, I think she found on average that it's actually connected by the wood wide web, as controversial as the metaphor is, to up to 37 other trees. And I think although there's a lot of challenges about, you know, the extent and importance of these systems, and there's a lot of questioning of the metaphor, I still think this is a really fundamental way of thinking differently about forest ecosystems. I grew up in the league of the field naturalists. So these were people as a child who went out there and we made lists of things. It might be spring. We'd make a list of the orchids that we'd find, or we might go out and make a list of the birds we'd find, or we'd go to the beach and we'd list all the intertidal organisms. And I was always making lists and inventories. And of course, this is very, very important. If we want to protect an area, we have to know what's there. We need a baseline of what organisms are there. But we rarely looked at the connections between them. No one said, this particular orchid is here, therefore it has a relationship with this fungus, or that this particular mammal is here and it feeds on truffle fungi. We pretty much just made lists of things. But I think this idea of connectivity is, I guess, I know it's sort of become a bit hackneyed, the idea of everything being connected, but I think it changes the way we walk into the garden or into the forest or onto the beach, and how we think about how things are linked up. And you know what's interesting? I was doing this little demonstration in a forest in France a few years ago, and one of the people who was holding onto the stocking. So basically, we've got one tree here. Here's the mycorrhizal network, and you're all other trees that are connected up. Okay, so you got the metaphor. We're all under the soil. And she's saying, "Oh, I love this little demonstration. I run a creche for little people. Can you bring them out into the forest and talk about mycelial networks and mycorrhizal symbiosis?" I'm saying, "How old are they?" She said, "Oh, 4 or 5. I said, "Don't you think they're a little bit small? These are big concepts. This is, it's very abstract. We can't see it. It's under the soil. Do you really think they'll get it?" And she looked at me and she said, "You're talking about, of course they will. You just bring your pantyhose and your pipe, you'll be right. Come along." I thought, wow, how do I explain this? Anyway, I'm not very experienced at working with little people. We get out into the forest, I get out my pipe, all the kids are tearing around, there's all these little people, and I said, "Grab an end of the stocking," and I was about to explain it. And this is when I made fundamental flaw number 1. I had 17 ends to the stocking and 18 children. So one of them was running, trying to grab an end, and each time she tried to get it, she missed out. And so all the other kids have got an end, and she's standing there with nothing, and bursts into a tantrum and starts spinning like a fly on her back, screaming French expletives at me. I'm thinking, oh, what do I do now? So I took off my hard hat and I put it on her head and I said, "You've got the most important job of all. You're the forester, and you've got to decide which of these trees you're going to cut down." This was fundamental flaw number 2. It took her about a millisecond. She eyes up this little guy like this, flies through the air and does a rugby tackle. He goes flying, and because all the kids are pulling madly, there's some tension of the web. He goes flying. The whole web breaks and all the children fall down on the ground. And they got the concept like that. And I'm not saying when we cut one tree in the forest down that all the trees fall down. Of course they don't, because I saw all the trees get back up and start hitting each other. It doesn't happen like that. But it's simply that when we do something to one tree or one river or one part of the forest or one anthill, there are reverberations. There are things that are happening often under the ground unseen that we don't always realise. And the effects of these things don't always manifest immediately. We can dam this river, make a dam, and oh, beautiful, we'll get some ducks on the dam. But we've now starved the rest of the catchment of receiving that water. Those plants only lived there because the water came down, it wasn't dammed. We can do something to this tree. We might not realise the implications of what we're affecting, how we're affecting the other trees or the fungi, perhaps for another season or a year or a decade. And this is where I think the whole notion of the precautionary principle, where we don't understand something fully, where we don't have all the pieces of the jigsaw as to how something works, we have to proceed with caution. And I know recently in Australia, for example, we have these burning regimes to try and stop catastrophic fires. We do smaller fires to try and stop bigger fires. But we don't really fully understand the ecosystems which we're burning. If we burn it after 5 years and we come back in 5 years again, are all those species back in the ecosystem? Are we getting the full complement of species back? And I think, again, with forestry, when we take out certain trees, how is it affecting other parts of the forest? So I just love that these kids are thinking not just in terms of making lists like I did. Here's a list of birds, here's a list of frogs, here's a list of orchids, but they're thinking, oh, there's implications, there's things we don't understand, there's connections, there's processes, there's interactions, and there's their own responsibility within that as to how they interact with those environments. So thank you very much, mycelium holders. I hope that little metaphor helps make sense. So I guess this is where fungi are really interesting for me. And I love these wonderful manifestations. Like you look at some of these forms, they come up like a phallus or like a lattice ball or like a little cup full of, bird's nest fungi. What kind of crazy evolutionary pressures drove them to manifest in all these amazing ways? I love their aesthetics. I love their ephemerality, how they come up and you've got this tiny window of time to observe them or to interact with them or photograph them or eat them or whatever you're doing. So I love these, the physical manifestations of fungi, but it's these ideas of mycelial networks and mycorrhizal interactions, but also how they are such different organisms to animals and plants, in that most of our frameworks for how we understand nature are built on the prototype of either an animal or a plant. And yet a fungus defies so much about how I understood nature when I was going through uni and before that. For example, we can look out the window and see this birch. How long does a birch live for? They're not very long lived, are they? Not even 100 years. How long does a birch tree live?
Yeah. How long does a birch tree live?
No, it depends. I mean, theory it can live very long, but of course the fungus will attack it. So,
Yeah. Okay.
so in theory, but I mean, in theory, I mean,
But it's
I don't think there's in theory really a sort of upper limit. But I would say that within 50 years, most of them would.
So defined lifespan, 50 years, maybe some might get to 100, but maybe 50 years. Homo sapiens in the first world, women 83.5 years is the average. A cockatoo in Australia can live to about 70, up to 100 years. So things have a defined lifespan. How long does a fungus live? What's the lifespan?
Thousands. Sometimes there is no limit.
There's no limit. So long as there's food, a food source, so imagine the mycelium under the soil, so long as there's organic matter for it to consume, it can keep growing, expanding, technically, infinitely, except it very rarely happens because guess what? Someone builds a road there. So the fungus, the organic matter's gone, it's got a road now, it can't eat the road, so in time it runs out of food, it's going to die. Or someone comes along and ploughs that field and breaks up the fungus organism. So my point is simply that fungi technically don't have a lifespan. But when I was at uni, this was the stuff of sci-fi, that something could have an infinite life. We have this dichotomy that Michael mentioned this morning of most organisms have, male, or all of them, male and female. But fungi contradict that again. We don't call it sexes with fungi, we call them mating types, and many have 2, some have a dozen, and some have tens of thousands. And that's a really weird concept, tens of thousands of sexes. That's a really bizarre concept. And then I can look out the window and see a bird. It's got 2 wings, it's got a beak, it's got a head. I can be pretty convinced that's the entire bird. It's a bounded organism. But where does the mycelium start and end? It's a pretty hard thing to go and, how do we know we're getting the whole organism? We can do some DNA testing. But my point is simply this notion of a fixed lifespan, being a bounded organism, having the dichotomy of sexes. This was never part of my learning about what nature was. And yet, aren't these much more imaginative ways that we could apply to how human societies operate? Much more decentralized system, a much less dichotomous system. So I think
thinking in that way, actually, also the birch can be much older, because sort of if you cut down a birch, you can have a second generation birch growing from the same stem, and sort of if you have a stand of aspens, I mean, they're probably clones.
Yeah.
It's the same tree, all those aspens that are growing. So thinking in that sense, also the age of the tree can be much longer.
Absolutely, and it's not just limited to fungi, you're right, and now we're expanding our concept of how long a plant can live and what actually an individual plant is. Are all these coppicing shoots actually new trees, individual trees? What's the individual what's the community, what's one organism. So I love that it's not just fungi, but plants are also expand. Also, you can talk about corals or even ant colonies operating too in this way. So I think it's an exciting time that we're actually expanding the frameworks upon which our understanding of nature is built, but also that we can apply that to human societies as well. I've got no idea how long I've spoken for, but maybe we could turn this into a conversation.